Silence is always private. Each time a loud instance inside ourselves. Well, these days we already have noise-canceling earphones. If you put one on, you will be able to hear yourself. Or if they're that costly or expensive, you'll be able to hear yourself breathing. It's because the noise from the surroundings is turned off, and so we are able to hear ourselves. You see, silence is an opportunity to hear and realize what matters more. In the slurry of confusion, of different emotions and thoughts from the past to the present, which is a constant challenge to move on one second to the next, and of course, the unpredictable future. From contemplating past failed relationships, I have come to realize that a relationship is a very long conversation. Everything goes well until silence happens. When it intensifies, but although in the movies, they say that love is when you enjoy each other's silences. That silence is part of the conversation, but there is also one that ends it. When it becomes internal and eternal, like when the other prefers silence, when the lover prefers himself or herself. And in literature, silence had become a significant device to apprehend the reader. Ever since the French symbolist poet Stéphane Mallarmé published his poem and used the spaces on the page as part of the poem. It's entitled Un coup de dé, jamais ne bolera le hasard. What a mouthful. The poem is originally, of course, in French, but what we have here is the English translation. Before which, the spaces on the page were only used to separate words, lines, verses, or chapters and paragraphs in the case of those genres that fall under fiction. Those typical forms that most of us might have been used to. Like, say, for example, in a novel, you have an event separated by two chapters, by several years apart. You're gonna separate them with, say, a page or so. In that space, when nothing was said, we know a lot of things had happened. Visual and concrete poetry are sort of cousins. Concrete poetry is an insurgence from the typical form of poetry, which is linear, wherein the lines are aligned. Although there may be certain indentions, they wouldn't be too much. Unlike in concrete poetry, wherein the shape of the poem it represents the object that it is describing or talking about. Like, say, for example, George Herbert's Easter Wings. Easter wings, right? Wings. So, and also other numerous examples like this dog, or this whale, or this rainbow. And visual poetry, on the other hand, employs images. Like, for example, Antigen by John Bennett and Scott McLeod, or For ER by Michael Basinski. And with visual and concrete poetry, I'm also going to discuss some parts of my poem today. Before everything else, here in the Philippines, visual and concrete poetry had been widely explored by several writers that we cannot trace when, but that would include including Pentakip Silim or Dr. Epitasio Togohon, who was declared as the father of visual poetry in the Philippines since 2011. Here we have an excerpt of his poem, The Day I Saw Myself, which is, I think, very much related to our discussion today. And yes, that is how it is arranged in the page, with unconventional placement of dot and an open parenthesis without its friend, the close parenthesis, just to drive a specific train of meaning. It says, but when, yes, when, but how, right here, right now. Yes, when I look again at this empty space, across the page of total blankness, I see a dot. I see a new page. I start to write. For now, I see myself again. So the speaker saw himself writing in the empty space. And this is the tradition where I am coming from as a Filipino writer, foreseeing that there is so much on the empty space that can be utilized to imply meaning. Contrary to the linear poem wherein the lines are given to the readers right away and is already imposed. And thus, I write beyond the traditional form. But let's go back to relationship first. You wouldn't be with your lover all the time. There will be times when you won't be talking to each other, like literally. Those silences will be defined by your past conversations, or maybe the things you want to talk to about in the future, be them crucial topic or not. Or those silences when you are mad at each other, and maybe moments after every fight. In those times, you are, the self will start talking within. We'll have those gaps when we'll try to sort off the confusion. For some, it may be pleasurable. Like, say, when you're still in those parts, when you're still cruising, or as how Barney Stinson might have put it, NRS, or new relationship smugness. And for some, it might be thinking it over if they're still going to continue playing the part of the boyfriend, the girlfriend, the lover, the partner, the husband, the wife, the partner, again, or not. Now, think of it as a poem. The lines and the text are those parts when you are together, when you are connecting with each other. And the silences are those parts when you're not talking, you're not connecting. In those times, you'll be doing a lot of thinking. And our perception of the world, even of our lover, depends upon ourselves. Ever since the time of the Greeks, it had been stated that the world is not as it is, but as who we are. Therefore, silence is private. Thinking it over is private. But we talk, we converse, we connect, we refuse to be silent. But there will come those times when you run out of words, when you run out of feelings, of emotions, of thoughts. And so you just stare and communicate through gestures and nonverbal signs. Either the lover will get this or not, we inside ourselves, of course, do. The lover will just have to assume that they do. And this is when the lover will have to read our silence. This is when silence apprehends. When the reader of the action, of the gesture, or of lines and text in case of literature, will have to find the meaning inside themselves based on the text. According to a research by Kim Knowles and her colleagues entitled Reading Space in Visual Poetry, New Cognitive Perspective, it said, space visually reinforces the organization of the conceptual organization of the text. They facilitate the process of perception guiding the eye and the mind. Therefore, space is necessary in order to read and understand text. Well, basically, poetry is just form, music, and language. But in the case of visual and concrete poetry, the form stands out. Although the other two basic elements shouldn't be left out. And this is a constant challenge in poetry. And the same research mentioned that poets have encroached the territory of the spatial arts by equipping their texts with a visual mimetic gestalt. Visual mimetic gestalt. What a phrase. Well, it just means that text has equipped itself fully with all the possibilities, everything that it can do, through borrowing from the visual arts. And poetry, being that it gives significance to its form, has come a very long way. We already have Microsoft Word, digital applications, Microsoft PowerPoint, Photoshop, etc., etc. It is from this leniency of the form and the technology that I was able to come up with my poem, Flom'lok. It is an 18-page poem about my hometown, which is born out of nostalgia, the poem, and not the place. I have to make that clear. And also, by virtue of our natural attention span, I won't have you read the whole thing, only some parts of it. Now, Flom'lok. Flom'lok, its tongue twister of a name, came from the Blaan tongue, Flom'lok, which means hunting grounds. And when I was new to Davao, every acquaintance was a hard time to make the pronunciation stick. Say, P, push the air out of the mouth for the first letter and roll over the rhythmic L, lulling O's, savoring M at the middle part to suddenly stop at the sharpness of K, suspending the tongue, the tip of the tongue afloat inside. Flom'lok. But the comprehension of the place or of its location only starts at the mentioning of pineapples and of Mount Matutum, which I think in itself, by its beauty and its majesty, is poetic. How, you may ask? Well, like this. If you're going to read the lines leading to the top, your eyes are as if hiking. But if this is an actual picture, it would require imagination. You will have to imagine yourself in your full battle gear or hiking, sweating, panting, ugly as the ground or the earth. But it will require imagination. But since it is text, you are already reading it, and consciously, you're already hiking. You're already there. And so, text, by virtue of duality, or a characteristic of having two nature, and in this case, a picture, an image, that is at the same time text, you are forced to see the text and read the text, and also be the text. Now, go back to the foot of the volcano, which is all around a very wide stretch of pineapple fields. And in this poem, it is defined and presented as an image and compressed to imply the sheer amount of fruits and spikes. Well, FYI, almost half of Flom'lok is more or less covered by pineapple fields. Now, direct your gaze to the word I. That is the speaker, or me, literally, when I was still writing or recalling the poem, early in the morning and taking in the view. Well, as you see, the image text exacts the instance when I felt the exquisite coldness of the climate in Flom'lok. A gentle warmth dance of cold and, warm air. The morning was creeping with small movements from the ground up, and a faint bustling of critters shook the grass minutely. The flower petals opened, awakened by the cozy air, and the moisture on the stems formed dews on the leaves, and the pineapple fields were coming to life in that sunrise. That is what is happening in the midst of the space between the I, or after the I, if only you will put yourself in the space of the speaker. Or if you take in and imagine and think of the image and, of course, of the spaces. And in this way, it is actually your silence and not my silence, because all of this, when you're reading, it is happening within you. And so, silence has taken hold of you. Silence has apprehended you. To explain it further, let me present this poem by Eugene Gomringer. He's a famous visual poet. It's entitled Silencio, or in English, Silence. In this poem, the space in the middle generates a paradox of absence and presence. Silence here is far better executed by the void of signification, because there is nothing there. And in that absence, it is better signifying absence than its signifier, the actual word silence. Because silence in the nothingness is significantly present, significantly clear, and having more meaning when it is not said in the middle. And also, and you see, space is the it's the primary element of text. It's the canvas where text can only exist, where um, language is malleable, as too is space. And since it's malleable, it could be an authorial controlling factor, meaning it is a literary device that can be manipulated. Like first and foremost, you can create an oscillating effect for the reader. Like say for example, you read the text and then you read the space. But wait, what does this space mean? So you go back to the text and then you go back to the space. So there is an oscillation. It is from this means of giving meaning to space that the next line are arranged like this. As I mentioned earlier, the poem Flom'lok is born out of nostalgia. The author or the speaker declared that he is not there at the beginning. So it is just a long episode of remembering, implied by the lines and of course by the length of the poem. And the organization connotes a spontaneous flow of memories, of speeches, of images, flowing or falling onto the page, which is sort of like consciousness. Memories just fall with it. But sometimes the remembrance is vivid as a picture. That's why the lines, the roads a kilometer stretch until spoiled, the same stretch, so on and so forth, employs a prosy syntax to mean the very long stretch of the road, which if you would convert that to a breath when reading a poem, is metaphorically a kilometer long. Furthermore, after that episode, the speaker was filled with desire to climb Mount Matutum. And so he talked to himself. Noticed when the line said, like a slithering serpent in remembrances, your eyes are also slithering on the page like a snake, further into the droning dynamo of desire and regret, continuing in commas, and finally the final dot to bring the truck to a stop, which is concretely executed in the line because it stopped. The snake stopped. The movement stopped. And so, therefore, through the means of space, the experience is exacted. For granting duality to text, the form supports the language. And linguistics does not stop at signs and signifiers. By employing silence, the emotion becomes even more real because of the because of apprehension. And even though each and everyone's silence is private, nostalgic experience can still be shared through the means of your own imagination. It's because of the abstract, the authentic, the formless, the antilinear, the open, and the free space. So, next time, when you happen to chance upon a concrete poem, a visual poem, or any poem with an unconventional form, read not only the text, read also the space. Because, after all, my dear audience, you are the presence in absence. Thank you.